2 years ago, I discovered my wife, Ronda, was having an affair. That discovery led to a vicious argument that ended with me packing my bags and moving out. Of course, my leaving wasn't because of the argument itself. I left because I wasn't going to live with a cheating woman. Our marriage was over the second she let another man into her life. I checked into a motel near my office. It was kind of seedy, but it would do until I found something more permanent. I placed the 2 suitcases I had packed into my room and walked to a nearby neighborhood bar, intent on getting drunk and drowning my sorrows without risking a DUI. The place I chose was almost empty, probably because it was a slow night. 2 couples were sitting at tables, and one older man sat at the bar nursing a bottle of beer. I found a booth on the far wall, away from everyone else, as I wasn't in the mood for conversation. The bored-looking waitress came over, and I ordered a shot of Jack and a beer. By the time I finished my second round, I'd had enough time to think. I realized I could either sit around feeling sorry for myself or do what I normally did: meet this problem head-on. I was a spec builder constructing upscale homes at the height of the housing boom. I usually had 2 or 3 houses in progress at any given time. When construction problems arose, I learned that tackling them right away saved me money. With a new resolve, I returned to the motel for a fitful night of sleep. The next morning, I went to the bank and moved all the money from our joint accounts into one in my name only, to protect myself. Then, I canceled all our joint credit cards, keeping 2 that were in my name only, along with the ones I had set up for my business. My final stop of the day was my lawyer's office to draw up divorce papers. Keith, a friend of mine and my lawyer, specialized in real estate law, but his wife, Shelley, handled family law. After they both expressed their condolences for my situation, we sat down to go over the details. I was given the usual spiel about this being a community property state, meaning she would be entitled to half of everything, and I would be responsible for child support. I told them I understood but made it clear I wasn't changing my mind. I instructed them to proceed with the paperwork. Because of our daughter, I filed for dissolution on the grounds of irreconcilable differences rather than adultery. I had done well in my business, so even having to give her half would still leave me well off. I just wanted to rid myself of a faithless wife. That night, I slept better, knowing I was taking charge of the situation. It was Friday evening, the second full day after I had packed my bags and left, when I received a call from Katie, my 13-year-old daughter. She told me she hadn't seen or heard from her mother since she got home from school, and that she was all alone and hungry. Cursing my hopefully soon-to-be ex, I jumped into my truck and headed home. I consoled my distraught daughter, and then went into the kitchen to fix her something to eat. It was while I was cooking that I noticed an envelope with my name on it, stuck under a magnet on the refrigerator. It was in my wife's handwriting. As curious as I was to see what was inside, I tossed it on the counter to read later, and continued making dinner for Katie. Only after we had eaten, watched a little TV, and I had put Katie to bed did I return to the kitchen. I picked up the envelope and went into the den. I poured myself a shot of bourbon, sat down, and opened it. Inside was a note from my wife, in which she said I was crazy if I thought she was going to raise another child. She said she was leaving and not to bother looking for her. To say I was stunned is an understatement. I realized I had never really known the woman I had married. I just couldn't understand how a mother could abandon her child. I went up to what had been her bedroom and saw that most of her clothes and personal items were gone. I waited until the next morning to call Keith and Shelley to discuss this new development and to find out how it would affect my attempt to divorce my wife. Shelley advised me to wait until Monday, and then she would accompany me to my wife's workplace. She would have the divorce papers drawn up, and we could have her served there. The hardest thing was sitting down with Katie to talk to her about what was going on. She already knew her mother, and I were having problems since I hadn't been home the last 2 nights. I decided that being honest with her was best, so I told her that her mother had left a note saying she was leaving. Other than that, I couldn't answer her questions about when she would come back because I didn't know myself. We managed to get through the weekend, and on Monday morning, I fed Katie her breakfast and dropped her off at school. I drove to my wife's workplace, where I met up with Shelley. Together, we went inside to inquire if my wife was there. At the mention of her name, we were directed to the Human Resources office, where we learned that she and her boss had both turned in their resignations the previous Friday. Somehow, I wasn't all that surprised. I had found out that the man she had been having the affair with was her boss. He was stupid enough to have a sexual relationship with an employee under his supervision, but smart enough to realize that when I made an issue of it, he was going to lose his job for breaking company policy against fraternization between managers and employees under their direction. Once outside in the parking lot, Shelley advised me that it would be in my best interest to file a missing persons report with the police. Since she had been gone for over 48 hours, they would be obliged to take the report, and with any luck, locate her. Shelley followed me down to the police station, where a detective took my statement that my wife was missing. I was honest with him, and told him that I wanted to find her so I could have her served with divorce papers. I showed him the note she had left and told him what we had learned about her and her lover quitting their jobs. He wanted to know if I had an alibi for the Friday she was last seen, and I assured him that I had spent the whole day at one of the houses I was building, with several contractors who could verify that. In the end, the detective told me that if they determined there was no foul play, and she had left of her own volition, there wasn't much they could do. I then offered to buy Shelley lunch, and we called her husband and met up at the Olive Garden. We requested a table that was fairly private so we could talk. "So, Shelley, what does this mean for the divorce if we can't find her to have her served?" I asked. "In this state, it means you'll have to wait for a year before you can file on the grounds of abandonment." "I'm sorry, Steve, but that's what the law states," Shelley answered. "The reason I wanted you to report her missing is so we have an official record of when she left to document it. Other than that, if the police don't locate her, your only other option, if you want to pursue it, is to hire a private agency to try to track her down." "Well, I guess that gives me something to think about. I'll wait until I hear from the police. Honestly, though, I don't even know if I'd want to know where she's gone. I'm in no hurry to get married again, if ever. I guess waiting a year isn't that big of a deal, as long as I don't have to deal with her." Shelley reached over and patted my hand. "Steve, I know how tough this is on you, and I know you're hurting right now, but as your friend, please promise me that you're not going to cut yourself off from life. For now, my focus is on Katie. I'm sure she's even more shocked and hurt than I am. I have to be there for her." Keith and Shelley both nodded their understanding and told me they were there for me and would help in any way they could. After lunch, I stopped by one of my job sites to check on the progress, and then went to Katie's school to wait for her to get out. As she exited the building, I saw her looking around almost frantically until she spotted my truck. Then she came running as fast as she could. I stepped out, and she flung herself into my arms. I could feel her shaking. "I was afraid you wouldn't be here." She sniffled into my neck, where she had buried her face. "Oh, baby, I promise I'm not going anywhere," I answered, hugging her tightly. "Do you really promise?" she asked, staring at me with her big blue eyes shimmering with tears. "Yes, honey, I really promise." I kissed her forehead and carried her around to the passenger side of the truck, buckling her in. With a little prodding, I finally got Katie to open up about her school day during the drive home. Once home, Katie wouldn't let me out of her sight. I continued to reassure her that I wasn't going to abandon her. Despite that, she began to have nightmares. I would wake up to hear her sobbing in her sleep, rush to her room, and find her clinging to me for dear life. When I asked her what she was dreaming about, she said she was lost and couldn't find either her mother or me. The biggest saving grace I had at this time was my office manager, Renee. I had hired her years ago to help me handle the many mundane aspects of my business, filing for permits, arranging inspections, and freeing me up to focus on more demanding tasks. Over time, I had come to rely on her completely. She now kept subcontractors on schedule, ordered and tracked materials, and handled all the necessary paperwork. I trusted her so much that she even wrote the checks for subs and vendors, which I would stop by to sign every Friday. When I had decided I needed help running my business, I placed an ad in the local paper and began interviewing applicants. I was getting discouraged after meeting people who didn't have the qualifications I needed, until Renee applied. I still remember the day she walked in the door. Even though I was married at the time, I could recognize a good-looking woman when I saw one. She was about 5'4", with big brown eyes and a cute button nose. I guessed her to be in her early 30s, and it was obvious she kept in shape. She wore a blue business suit that wasn't revealing but still hinted at her trim figure. The interview went well. I was impressed by her qualifications, as she had worked for her father, who owned a construction company and was well-versed in the business. When I asked why she no longer worked for him, she explained that her husband had been transferred to this area, so they had to move. I also learned she had a daughter the same age as my Katie, and now that her daughter was in school, Renee wanted to return to the workforce. We reached an agreement on wages, and I finally had an office manager. Don't get the wrong idea. Nothing ever happened between us, not even flirting. I was married and took my vows seriously, and even if I hadn't been, she was married, and I had a strict rule about not messing with another man's woman. For her part, it was clear she loved her husband very much, and wasn't the type to cheat. When I let Renee know about what was happening with my marriage and Katie's nightmares, she immediately suggested therapy for Katie. I realized she was right, and with her help, found a therapist willing to work with us. I chose a woman therapist because Katie had always been shy around men she didn't know. I met with Dr. Walters to explain everything that had happened and why I felt therapy was necessary for Katie. We set up a schedule for Katie to meet with her twice a week. Dr. Walters also wanted me to be available for some sessions where we could work together. Meanwhile, the police sent over a female detective to speak with Katie as part of the missing persons report I had filed. Katie told them the last time she had seen her mother was Friday morning before school. She mentioned that her mother had seemed distracted, but hadn't thought much of it at the time. About a week later, I was asked to come down to the station to meet with the detective I had initially spoken with. He informed me that their investigation had tracked my wife's lover's credit card usage to 2 motels and confirmed, through surveillance footage, that the two of them were together of their own free will. They had apparently left the state. Since there was no evidence of foul play, the police wouldn't pursue the case further. The next 2 months passed, and therapy seemed to be working for Katie. She finally began to understand that it wasn't her fault her mother had left, and more importantly, that I would always be there for her. Her nightmares became less frequent, and she no longer needed to keep me in sight at all times. During this time, Renee and her husband, James, started inviting Katie and me over for barbecues. At first, I was hesitant to accept, but Renee convinced me it would be good for Katie to spend time with their daughter, Jenny, doing normal activities. I had met James on a few occasions and was a little worried about how he might feel about his wife inviting her boss to their home. However, my concerns were quickly laid to rest. James and I bonded easily and became good friends. Katie and Jenny also became inseparable, practically best friends overnight. Renee, being a loving mother, went out of her way to make Katie feel comfortable and supported, giving her the kind of motherly guidance she sorely needed. I often found myself thanking my lucky stars for having such good people in our lives. Little did I know, tragedy would strike again. 10 weeks after my wife left, I decided it was time to clear out the remnants of her presence from my bedroom. Although she had taken many of her clothes and personal belongings, some of her things remained. I brought up a couple of large garbage bags and began going through her drawers, emptying them out. In the last drawer, tucked into the back, I found a small box. Curious, I opened it and gasped at what I found. Inside was a baggie containing at least a 1/4 ounce of marijuana and a vial of white powder. I wasn't naive about drugs. In my younger days, before I married Katie's mother, I had experimented with them, but had left that life behind after college. I opened the vial and sniffed it cautiously. Then I took a tiny amount of the powder on my finger and tasted it. Cocaine. The only other thing in the box was a CD. I turned on my computer and inserted the disc to see what was on it. What I found shocked me to my core. It was a video, shot in our basement. I recognized the space immediately. One side of the basement was set up with exercise equipment, while the other was a game room with a pool table, plush couches, and a large screen TV. The video showed 4 couples sitting or standing, most of them holding drinks. 2 of the people were my wife and her boss. I fast-forwarded through the footage and saw them passing around joints and snorting lines of cocaine off the glass top of a coffee table. Skipping further ahead, I saw something that made my stomach turn. My wife engaged in sex with multiple men. I barely made it to the bathroom before I vomited. I finished emptying my stomach in the toilet, and then sat there, dazed, for a while. Finally, I pulled myself together and shut the video off without watching any more. After cleaning up the mess I'd made in the bathroom, I called Shelley to ask for advice. "Hey Shelley, it's Steve. Got time to talk?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Steve, Keith, and I always have time for you." "What's up?" she replied. "Well, I decided to get rid of some of Ronda's stuff that was just taking up space, and I found a box in one of her drawers. It had drugs in it and a CD. The CD, well, it's a video of her and her friends doing drugs and having unprotected group sex. That woman had an orgy in my basement," I said, the disgust evident in my voice. "Oh, God, Steve, I'm so sorry. I know you'd never want to see something like that. Honestly, I don't think reporting the drugs is a good idea. They're in your house, and it would be your word against hers as to who they belong to. I think you'd be better off getting rid of them," she advised. "And the CD?" I asked. "Since it was filmed in your home, it could be admissible evidence in court, especially if custody becomes an issue. I'd suggest hiding it somewhere secure, just in case," she said. "That's what I was hoping you'd say. I intend to do everything I can to keep her away from Katie," I replied. Shelley assured me she would help me in any way possible, but I couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of betrayal and disgust. That video was proof that I had never really known the woman I had married. The discovery of the drugs and video left me shaken, but I knew I couldn't dwell on it. My focus remained on Katie and ensuring she was happy and secure. Over the next year, life slowly settled into a new normal for us. Therapy continued to help Katie, and her bond with Ginny grew stronger. Meanwhile, Renee and James became our closest friends, always there to lend a hand or a kind word when we needed it most. Then, out of nowhere, tragedy struck again. James, an avid cyclist who competed in amateur races, suffered a deep thigh bruise during a race pileup. None of us realized the seriousness of the injury. A blood clot formed and broke loose, lodging in his brain and causing a massive stroke. The call came while Renee and I were at the office. I was reviewing plans for a new house when I heard her phone ring. A few moments later, I heard her cry out, and I rushed to her side. She stared at me with wide, frantic eyes. "It's James," she blurted. "They've rushed him to the hospital." She grabbed her purse and bolted toward the door. I quickly followed her. "Come on, get in my truck. I'll drive," I said when I caught up to her. At first, she looked at me blankly, then nodded, letting me lead her. I helped her into the passenger seat and got behind the wheel. The entire drive to the hospital, she didn't say a word. When I glanced over, I saw her trembling, her face pale with worry. We arrived at the emergency entrance, and Renee leaped out of the truck, running inside. I parked quickly and rushed in to find her. She was already at the reception desk, asking about James. When the nurse explained that the doctors were working on him, but didn't have any updates yet, Renee broke down. I put my arm around her and led her to the waiting area, where we sat in silence. As time passed, I realized it was nearing the time to pick up our daughters from school. Not wanting to leave Renee alone, I called Shelley and explained the situation, asking if she could pick up the girls and bring them to the hospital. She agreed without hesitation. I then called the school to let them know someone else would be picking up the girls. When Shelley arrived, I stepped out to meet her and the girls. Renee was in no state to explain things to Ginny, so I took Ginny aside and gently told her that her father was in the hospital and that it was serious. She put on a brave face, but I could see the fear in her eyes. I led her back to the waiting room, where she immediately went to her mother. Katie sat with me quietly, holding my hand as we waited. After about an hour, a nurse came out and asked us to follow her. She led us to a private sitting room, where a doctor joined us shortly after. The news was grim. James was alive, but on life support. The stroke had caused catastrophic damage. Renee collapsed in tears, and I held her as she sobbed. When James was finally moved to the ICU, Renee and Jenny were allowed to see him. Hours later, Renee returned to the waiting room, looking exhausted. "Steve, will you take Ginny home with you?" "I'm going to stay here," she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jeannie started to protest, but I knelt down in front of her. "Sweetie, your mom needs you to be strong for her right now. Come home with Katie and me tonight. I'll bring you back first thing in the morning, I promise." Tears streaming down her face, Ginny nodded. She hugged her mother tightly before taking Katie's hand. I gave Renee a hug as well, telling her to call me if anything changed. That evening was somber. Both girls were unusually quiet, barely touching their dinner. When I finally got them to bed, they clung to each other, falling asleep in the same bed. The next morning, I woke the girls and gently encouraged them to eat breakfast. Katie resisted at first, not wanting to leave Ginny, but I explained that Ginny needed to be with her mom and that Katie would need to be strong for her when the time came. Reluctantly, Katie agreed. I took Ginny to her house to pack a bag of clothes and essentials for her mother. When we arrived at the hospital, we found Renee asleep in a chair beside James's bed. I led Ginny back out to the waiting room to let her mother rest. After another hour, Renee came out, her face haggard but grateful for the change of clothes and the support. The rest of the day was spent alternating between the waiting room and James's room. I made sure Renee ate, though it took some coaxing. By late afternoon, the doctors ran another battery of tests, but the prognosis hadn't improved. That evening, I brought the girls home again, knowing Renee would stay by James's side. At 5:30 the next morning, my phone rang. I knew before I even answered it. Renee was on the other end, sobbing. James had passed away during the night. I told her how sorry I was and promised we would be there as soon as possible. I quickly dressed and went to wake the girls. Katie began crying when I told her what had happened, but I reminded her that Ginny would need her strength. Katie wiped her tears and nodded, looking more mature than her 14 years. When I told Ginny the news, she broke down, and I held her as she sobbed. "Your mom needs you right now," I said gently. With Katie's help, she got dressed, and we headed to the hospital. Seeing Renee and Ginny in a tearful embrace broke my heart. Katie clung to me tightly, crying as well. I took care of the hospital arrangements, informing them that a funeral home would be contacting them soon. I then led Renee and Ginny back to my truck and drove them home. Once there, I settled them into the den and asked Renee for a list of people to call. She gave me the names of James's brother and a few friends, as well as her parents, who lived out of state. I also called Shelley and Keith, knowing they would want to help. Shelley came over immediately to assist Renee with the estate matters, assuring her that she would handle everything pro bono. As exhaustion finally caught up to Renee, Shelley and I helped her to bed. Before leaving, Shelley promised to take care of all the legal details, including reviewing James's will. The next few days were a blur of tears, planning, and comforting the girls. Renee's parents flew in, and I picked them up from the airport. They were kind, supportive people who quickly embraced Katie and me as part of their extended family. The funeral was held on Friday, and it was clear how much James had been loved. Friends, Coworkers, and even many of the subcontractors who had worked with me over the years showed up to pay their respects. After the funeral, Renee's parents stayed for a few more days, urging her to move back to their home state. Though tempted by their offer, Renee decided to take her time making any major decisions. She admitted she needed to think about what would be best for her and Ginny. Over the following weeks, Katie and I visited Renee and Ginny regularly to check on them. I could see Renee struggling to cope, but she remained strong for her daughter. I didn't push her to decide on her future, knowing she needed time to grieve. Then, one Monday morning, I arrived at the office and saw Renee's car parked outside. I walked in and found her sitting at her desk. "Well, boss, are you going to show me what you've messed up over the last couple of weeks so I can fix it?" she said with a small smile. "Does this mean?" I started. "Yes, it means we're staying. This is Ginny's home, and all her friends are here. Moving would only make things harder for her. Besides," she added with a smirk, "we both know you need me to keep your business running." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "You sure know how to butter up your boss," I said with a grin. Life slowly began to return to normal. Katie and Ginny's friendship grew even stronger, and Renee and I continued to support each other as friends. But as time went on, our bond began to deepen in ways neither of us had anticipated. Over the next year, Renee and I spent more and more time together, mostly because of Katie and Ginny's friendship. The girls were practically inseparable, which naturally led to us attending school events, sports games, and other activities together. On weekends, if the girls weren't busy, they were usually at my house, swooning in the pool or doing homework. I always made sure to invite Renee as well. I didn't want her sitting at home alone. Our friendship continued to grow, and I found that I could talk to her about anything. Renee had become a surrogate mother to Katie, and I could see how much Katie valued her guidance. Renee was someone Katie could talk to about things a teenage girl wouldn't feel comfortable discussing with her father. Meanwhile, I found myself becoming a father figure to Ginny, though I was much less effective as a disciplinarian. Whenever I tried to lay down the law, both girls would giggle at me. It was always Renee who had to step in if they needed a firm hand. Thankfully, they were both good girls, and discipline was rarely necessary. Then, one Saturday about a year after James passed away, something happened that changed everything. I had gone to one of the houses I was building to resolve a minor issue. When I got back home, I noticed Renee's car in the driveway. We had planned a barbecue that day and were going to spend time lounging around the pool. I assumed everyone was outside, so I grabbed my swim trunks from the laundry room and decided to change in the downstairs bathroom. Normally, I would have gone to my bedroom, but I figured it was quicker this way. As I opened the bathroom door, I froze. Renee was standing there, reaching for her bikini top, wearing nothing but a skimpy pair of panties. She gasped and instinctively crossed her arms over her chest, and I quickly backed out, shutting the door behind me. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," I stammered through the closed door, my face burning with embarrassment. I rushed into the living room, flustered and mortified, wondering if I had just ruined our friendship. I couldn't believe I had walked in on her like that. 10 minutes passed before Renee came out, now wearing her bikini. She saw the shame written all over my face as I struggled to apologize. "Renee, I'm so sorry. I heard the girls out by the pool and thought you were out there too. I didn't mean to walk in on you. Please believe me," I said in a rush. She stood in front of me, trying to look stern, but her expression softened after a few seconds. She started laughing and walked over, patting my cheek. "Steve, I know you'd never do that on purpose. It's okay. Don't worry about it. Now go get changed and put the chicken on the grill. I'm starving." With that, she turned and headed outside to join the girls by the pool. I stood there for a moment, stunned. Relief washed over me as I realized she wasn't upset. I quickly changed and went out back to grill the chicken. Renee was sipping wine while the girls played in the pool, laughing and splashing each other. I tried to focus on cooking, but the image of her standing there in just her panties lingered in my mind. After we ate, we sat on lounge chairs by the pool, soaking up the sun. We talked as easily as we always had, though I noticed her smirking at me a couple of times. At one point, during a lull in the conversation, she looked over at me with a mischievous grin. I knew I must have turned red. She laughed softly and let it go. By the time the sun began to set, the girls had decided that Katie would spend the night at Renee's house. As they ran to the car, Renee came over to say goodbye. She kissed me on the cheek, gave me another sly grin, and left. I stood there for a long time after they drove off, wondering if I had imagined the playfulness in her demeanor. That night, as I lay in bed, my mind drifted back to the events of the day. I couldn't stop thinking about Renee. I remembered how beautiful she had looked in the bathroom, and then again in her bikini. I realized I hadn't felt this way about anyone since Ronda left. I had been so consumed with raising Katie and running my business that I hadn't even considered the possibility of being with another woman. But now my feelings for Renee were undeniable. I had no idea if she felt the same way, and I was terrified of ruining our friendship by saying anything. The following week was awkward for me. Whenever I was in the office, I found myself stealing glances at Renee, wondering if she had noticed the change in me. I avoided spending too much time there, opting to visit the construction sites instead. I didn't understand my feelings. Renee had always been my friend, someone I trusted and depended on. But now, something was different. The next Saturday, two things were happening. First, Renee and I were dropping the girls off at a 2-week sleepaway sports camp. Second, the local building association was hosting its annual awards dinner. It was being held at a hotel ballroom, with dinner, awards, and dancing. Renee was going with me as my guest. That morning, we dropped the girls off at camp. They were so excited to be there that they nearly forgot to say goodbye. Watching them run off laughing, Renee and I couldn't help but laugh as well. I drove her back to her house, telling her I'd pick her up at 6 o'clock for the event. When I knocked on her door that evening, my jaw nearly hit the floor. Renee was wearing a little black dress that was classy yet sexy, paired with a pearl necklace, black stockings, and high heels. She looked stunning. "God, you're beautiful," I said, unable to stop myself. She smiled, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "Why, thank you, kind sir." During the drive to the hotel, I focused on the road, trying to keep our conversation casual. Inside, though, I felt like a nervous teenager. At the dinner, we were seated at a table with 3 other builders and their wives. The conversation was light, mostly shop talk, and the food was surprisingly good for an event like this. When my name was called for the Quality of Product Award, Renee jumped to her feet, clapping enthusiastically. I kept my acceptance speech short, thanking the association for the recognition and giving credit to Renee for her hard work. "This award is hers as much as mine," I said, glancing at her. "Without her efforts, I wouldn't be standing here today." When I returned to the table, Renee hugged me and, to my surprise, kissed me on the lips. It was a brief, chaste kiss, but it sent a jolt of electricity through me. Her eyes shimmered with emotion as she whispered, "I'm so proud of you." Later, when the dance floor opened, I asked her to dance. The first song was fast, and I marveled at how graceful she looked as she moved. The next song was a slow one, and as I began to lead her back to the table, she slid her arms around my neck and pulled me close. I hesitated for a moment, then placed my hands on her waist. Holding her felt both natural and electric, and I couldn't deny the emotions bubbling inside me. When the song ended, I let her precede me back to the table, praying she hadn't noticed the effect she had on me. My heart was pounding, and I realized that something had shifted between us that night. On the drive home from the awards dinner, Renee suggested something that caught me completely off guard. "Steve, I think a perfect way to end this evening would be to soak in your hot tub. What do you say?" I couldn't say no. The thought of spending more time with her, especially after the way I felt during that slow dance, was impossible to resist. "Sure," I replied, trying to keep my voice even. Let's do that. When I built my house, I had it equipped with all the latest smart home technology. I could control the heating, cooling, lighting, and even the hot tub remotely. By the time we arrived, the hot tub was already heated and bubbling. Renee often left a swimsuit at my place since she and Jeannie spent so much time at the pool during the summer, so I grabbed her suit along with mine. She went to the bathroom to change, while I changed in the laundry room. I was already in the hot tub when she walked out onto the deck. The sight of her in that bikini stopped me in my tracks. I had seen her in it many times before, but something about the moonlight glinting off her skin made her look breathtaking. She slid into the water across from me and accepted the glass of wine I handed her. For the first few minutes, we didn't say much, simply enjoying the warmth of the water and the peaceful night. Then Renee broke the silence. "Steve, it's been over 2 years since Ronda walked out on you. Have you thought about having a woman in your life again?" she asked, her tone casual but her eyes searching mine. I froze. I wasn't expecting such a direct question. My face flushed, and I silently prayed the dim light would hide it. "The truth is, I haven't thought about it much," I admitted. "At least, not until recently." "Recently?" she asked, her lips curving into a sly smile. What changed? I stumbled over my words, trying to figure out how to respond without revealing too much. "I don't know. I guess I trailed off, avoiding her gaze. Renee set her wine glass down on the edge of the tub. Her hand reached behind her neck, and in one smooth motion, she untied her bikini top. I watched, dumbfounded, as the top floated to the surface of the water. Then she rose slightly, just enough for the bubbles to part and reveal her bare chest. My jaw dropped. "Was it seeing me like this?" she asked softly. "Renee," I groaned, my body betraying me as I felt myself harden under the water. Before I could say anything else, she moved toward me, straddling my lap. Her arms slid around my neck, and her face was inches from mine. My hands instinctively rested on her waist. "Steve, when James died, I didn't think I'd ever have feelings for anyone again. But he and I used to talk about this, what we'd want for each other if one of us passed. He made me promise that I wouldn't close myself off from love, that I'd let myself move on. I will always love him, but I've realized there's room in my heart for someone else." She paused, her eyes searching mine. "Am I making a fool of myself?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. I shook my head, still stunned. "No, you're not," I whispered. "I've been fighting my feelings for you because I was scared of losing your friendship. But the truth is, I'm in love with you, Renee." Her lips curved into a smile before she kissed me, softly at first, then with growing intensity. That night, we made love for the first time, right there in the hot tub, and then again in my bedroom. It was wild, passionate, and everything I hadn't realized I'd been missing. The next morning, I woke up with her curled up against me. "Good morning, beautiful," I murmured, brushing her hair back from her face. She opened her eyes and smiled. "Good morning, stud," she replied with a giggle. She reached down under the sheets, wrapping her hand around me. "Are you always hard in the morning?" I grinned. "What can I say? I've always had a high sex drive. And you? Well, you bring it out even more." She gave me a wicked smile and climbed on top of me, teasing me with a slow, deliberate rhythm until we both couldn't hold back any longer. Afterward, we showered together before heading to the kitchen for breakfast. I made us omelets while she sat at the table, watching me with a contented smile. After we ate, we took our coffee out to the back deck. For a while, we just sat quietly, enjoying each other's company. Then, out of nowhere, Renee asked, "Did you mean it, Steve?" I looked at her, confused. "Did I mean what?" "What you said last night, that your heart belongs to me." I took her hand and held it tightly. "Renee, we've known each other for 7 years now. For the first 5, you were my right hand, the person I depended on. 2 years ago, You and James helped Katie and me through one of the hardest times in our lives. Over the past year, you've become my closest friend. And now, I realize I'm head over heels in love with you. So yes, I meant every word. My heart is yours." Tears welled up in her eyes, but they were tears of joy. "I love you too," she whispered. "I want us to belong to each other, completely." The rest of that Sunday was spent in a blissful haze of love and laughter. We couldn't keep our hands off each other, and every kiss, every touch, felt like it was healing the wounds of our pasts. Monday morning, we woke up together and showered before heading to her house so she could grab fresh clothes for work. When we got to the office, she fixed coffee while I went over paperwork. I kissed her before heading out to check on the job sites, and for the first time in years, I felt a sense of peace and happiness I hadn't thought possible. For the next 2 weeks, while the girls were at camp, Renee and I made the most of our time alone. Our relationship grew stronger with each passing day. We spent our evenings cooking dinner together, talking about everything and anything, and making love late into the night. By the time the girls returned, we both knew this wasn't just a fling. It was the start of something real and lasting. We decided to talk to the girls separately about the idea of merging our families. Renee would speak with Ginny, and I would talk to Katie. We agreed that if either of the girls had reservations, we would wait. Their happiness was our priority. When I sat Katie down to discuss it, she surprised me by squealing with excitement and throwing her arms around my neck. "Daddy, I think it's wonderful. Ginny will really be my sister, and I already love Renee like a mom." Her reaction brought tears to my eyes. "I'm glad you feel that way, sweetheart, but we need to wait and see how Ginny feels about it before we make any decisions, okay?" Katie nodded, though I could tell she was eager to call Ginny and start planning their new life together. A short time later, the house phone rang. Caller ID said it was Renee. She told me that Ginny wanted to talk to Katie, but wouldn't give any hints about how the conversation had gone. I handed the phone to Katie, who immediately ran off to her room for privacy. I spent the next hour pacing nervously, wondering what was being said. Then suddenly, Katie burst out of her room and ran outside. I heard what sounded like happy squeals, and moments later, she came back in with Ginny and Tao. Both girls threw themselves at me, hugging me tightly. As I looked up, I saw Renee standing in the doorway, smiling warmly, with 2 suitcases in her hands. My heart swelled with emotion as I realized that, at long last, our families were coming together. The girls ran upstairs, dragging the suitcases with them, leaving Renee and me alone in the living room. I stood there, still processing everything, until Renee walked over to me. Without saying a word, she wrapped her arms around my neck and kissed me. It was a kiss full of love, relief, and excitement for what was to come. "I guess this means they're on board," I said with a chuckle once we broke apart. "Apparently our daughters were ahead of us on this one," Renee replied with a laugh. Ginny told me that she and Katie had already talked about us being together and were just waiting for us to figure it out. We both laughed at how perceptive our daughters were. That evening, we went out for dinner to celebrate the joining of our families. Sitting at the table, watching the girls giggling and whispering to each other, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. After everything Katie and I had been through, life was finally moving forward in a way I never thought possible. Over the next few days, Renee and Ginny officially moved in. We made several trips to her house, bringing over furniture, clothes, and other belongings. Renee and I decided to sell her house, as the real estate market was hot, and it didn't make sense to hold on to it. When the sale went through, she wanted to put the money into a joint account, but I had a better idea. We decided to place the funds in a savings account for Ginny's college expenses. It felt like the right thing to do, and I knew James would have wanted it that way. Life in our blended household settled into a happy rhythm. Katie and Ginny were thrilled to be living under the same roof, and the two of them became as close as sisters. Renee and I quickly adjusted to sharing a home, and it felt natural having her there. Of course, There were some minor challenges, like the fact that I was now outnumbered 3-1 by females. But I didn't mind. The laughter, love, and warmth in the house more than made up for it. One day, about a month after they moved in, Katie came to me with a question that caught me completely off guard. She sat me down at the kitchen table, looking unusually serious. "Daddy, can I ask you something?" she began. "Of course, sweetheart. What's on your mind?" I asked. "Well, you love me, and I'm your daughter, right?" "Of course," I said, a little confused by her question. "And you love Ginny, too, right? Like you love me?" I nodded. "Yes, I do. You both mean the world to me." "Then how come you haven't adopted her yet?" she asked, tilting her head. "Wouldn't it make her really your daughter, like me?" Her question hit me like a ton of bricks. I hadn't considered adoption, but as soon as she said it, I realized how much I wanted that too. I glanced over at Ginny, who was sitting nearby, watching me intently. Tears were already forming in her eyes, and her chin was trembling. "Honey," I said, turning to her, "there's nothing I'd love more than to make you my daughter legally. Would that be something you'd like?" Jeannie's tears spilled over as she nodded. "Yes, Daddy, I really would." Hearing her call me Daddy for the first time broke me. I opened my arms, and she flew into them, sobbing as I held her close. Katie joined in, wrapping her arms around us. At that moment, Renee walked in, carrying bags of groceries. She froze in the doorway, confused at first, until Katie rushed over to her and whispered what had just happened. Renee dropped the bags and ran over, joining the group hug. There were tears all around, but they were tears of pure joy. Later that night, after the girls had gone to bed, Renee and I sat together on the couch, holding hands. "Are you sure about this, Steve?" she asked softly. "Adopting Ginny is a big step." "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," I replied. "She's already my daughter in my heart. This just makes it official." The adoption process took several months, but by the end of it, Jeannie legally became my daughter. The day it was finalized, we celebrated with dinner at Ginny's favorite restaurant, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like our family was truly complete. The next few years flew by. Katie and Ginny excelled in school, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. Renee and I continued to build our life together, both personally and professionally. My business thrived, in no small part thanks to Renee's efforts. As my workload grew, Renee began taking on more responsibilities in the field, managing subcontractors, and ensuring everything ran smoothly. We even hired another office assistant to help with the administrative tasks. Renee and I married the following spring in a small, intimate ceremony. Shelley was Renee's bridesmaid, and Keith served as my best man. The girls were ecstatic, acting as each other's maids of honor. The wedding was simple, held in our backyard, surrounded by close friends and family. Afterward, Renee and I went to Fiji for a week-long honeymoon. It was paradise. But even more than the gorgeous beaches, I cherished the time we spent together, reaffirming our love for one another. When we returned, life resumed its happy routine. Katie began calling Renee Mom not long after the wedding, which melted my heart. And just after Ginny's 17th birthday, she called me Dad for the first time. I don't even remember what she wanted at the time, but I'll never forget the moment. She kissed me on the cheek and said, "Thank you, Daddy," as casually as if she'd been saying it her whole life. I barely held back tears, and when I glanced at Renee, I saw her wiping her eyes too. As the girls prepared for college, Renee and I grew closer than ever. We had built a beautiful life together, full of love, laughter, and hope. It wasn't the life I had envisioned when Ronda left all those years ago. It was better. Together, we had turned tragedy into a second chance at happiness, not just for us, but for our daughters as well. And for that, I would always be grateful. Thanks to everyone who took the time to listen to today's stories. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already. Feel free to share your thoughts on the events in the comments below. Take care.